Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Axis Bank, I welcome you to the 20th edition of Treasury Market Talks. Axis Bank has been instrumental in serving a wide spectrum of customers through its innovative financial solutions and products, covering large and mid corporates, SMEs, multinationals, agriculture, and retail businesses. The bank has leveraged the power of technology to provide uninterrupted, best in class service, benefiting its wide customer base. We aim to equip clients with high quality inputs around emerging issues, and to this end, regularly host Treasury Market Talks events with well respected thought leaders within the macroeconomics and geopolitics and market space. In the past, we've been honored by the presence of many eminent speakers. Nobel laureate Professor Stiglitz, Professor Michael Pettis of China, Professor Otmar Issing, and Baroness Ashton. The talk series has been received very well by all stakeholders with great enthusiasm and participation from leaders in the corporate world as well as other diverse fields. We had our first TMT back in 2020 on the US presidential election, and our speaker then was Todd Buchholz. It was a great success. The insights we had and the engagement we received from that. Today we welcome back Todd for his insights on the US political economy ahead of the coming election. As you might recall, Todd served as Director of Economic Policy under George H.W. Bush, was Managing Director of Tiger Management, a leading economist with his own Buchholz hypothesis, and author, and also a theatrical producer. We are also delighted to welcome Tyler Grassmeyer of the Observatory Group for his political insights. Tyler is former Chief of Staff to the U.S. House and former advisor to U.S. Senator Ben Sasse. Speaking with Todd and Tyler is Brejesh Chalill, head of Treasury Sales at Axis Bank. Some housekeeping announcements before we begin. Participation is by invitation only. Axis Bank reserves the right to block access to any person to whom an invitation has not been sent. Unauthorized dissemination of the contents of this webinar is strictly prohibited, and prior explicit permission of Axis Bank is imperative. As a reminder, all participant viewing panels will be in the view-only mode. Participants who wish to ask questions may post them on the question box on your screens. Please note that this conference is being recorded and may involve the presence of the media. On behalf of Axis Bank, I once again welcome all our customers to this event. I now hand over the forum to Brejesh. Thank you, Brejesh. Over to you.
Thank you for that, Pranay. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you joining us on this 23rd edition of Treasury Market Talks, titled US Presidential Elections, Trends and Implications of Red versus Blue. My name is Brejesh. I'll be your host for tonight. I head the Treasury Market Sales business here at Axis. As Pranay mentioned, we have with us Todd Buchholz. He's been the former Director of Economic Policy at the White House, a famed author, a novelist, economist. We've been lucky to have Todd with us before. Todd, lovely to have you back, joining us so early. Thank you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. And, for everyone's benefit, Todd's logging in all the way from the other side of the world, and we woke him up pretty early. So, Todd, thank you. Thanks for joining us at this early hour.
Well, I'm in California. It's so early here. I think Bill Clinton is still president. We've gone back in time, but I'm delighted to be with my friends at Axis and your clients.
Thank you, Todd. Lovely to have you. We also have with us Tyler Grassmeyer. Tyler's a senior Washington analyst with the Observatory Group. He's been a former chief of staff to multiple members of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's also worked very closely as an advisor with Ben Sasse, the U.S. Senator of Nebraska. So, Tyler, lovely to have you with us here.
Great. Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
And I think you're joining us, if I'm not mistaken, from the middle of the battleground, right? It's Washington, is it?
I am in Washington today. Yes, absolutely. It is the place where all the action is happening. Actually, all the action, and we'll get into this later, is happening outside of Washington right now, not in Washington, in all the swing states. So,
okay. So I'm going to pencil that in for a question for you, Tyler. So, gentlemen, this is how we're going to run today's session. We'll break this up into 4 parts. The first is, I think, like you correctly mentioned, Tyler, I'll come back to you right at it with the swing states and maybe the electoral issues. After that, Todd, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, taxes and tariffs. This is, in a way, with the Democrats weighing heavily on the tax side and, Trump calling in for the tariffs. It'll be good to see and understand that better. And then, Tyler, back to you on geopolitics. Obviously, if America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, and the US is having a everyone. And then Todd, over to you on the market, inflation, all of that. But 10 days from the world's most watched election, and we did see Kamala Harris come in a bit late to the party, but I would say she hit the ground running. She managed to, I would say, handle the debates pretty well, the early debates, especially compared to, Biden, who was fielding it earlier. And then we've seen her raise almost $1 billion in campaign money. I think it's a new record of sorts. She's managed the women voters pretty well. And then for someone who was gliding in so well, I think the last few weeks we've seen some glitches. She's bungled the Fox interviews. I think the Alfred Smith traditional dinner was also given a miss. And we've seen Trump kind of make a comeback. So I don't know, but whether to kind of believe those polls. Those polls have had it wrong before. The polls indicate that today, Trump has 23% of the black voter votes as well. So male black voter votes as well. So I don't know. I'd just love to hear, before we jump into the 4 quadrants, I'd love to hear from you, Todd and Tyler. What's happening on the ground? If you could share with us, anyone who wants to go first.
Go ahead, Todd.
Oh, well, look, every election I've witnessed since I was a child, Americans would say, if Ronald Reagan wins, I'm moving to Canada. If Jimmy Carter wins, I'm moving to Canada. If George Bush wins, or Michael Dukakis, or John Kerry, or Barack, I'm moving to Canada. The problem today is Justin Trudeau in Canada is so unpopular, Americans realize Canada is not a great place either. So we're stuck with 2 candidates who are disliked by large segments of the population. The irony is the economy's in pretty good shape at the moment. And yet Joe Biden and Kamala Harris get no credit for that. Why don't they get credit for that? Because the inflation was so searing after COVID that if you have inflation of 20%, effectively your standard of living has dropped 20%. So you've got Democrats going around, along with a lot of Democratic-leaning economists who say, we don't understand why the American people are so grumpy. The unemployment rate is low. The inflation rate has come down. GDP is on track at 3.4% this quarter. Why don't they love us? Well, they don't love you because their standard of living fell 20%. And they look back at Donald Trump and say, this guy is a kind of lamentable, vile, detestable character. But you know what? My wallet was a lot thicker when he was president. My bank account was a lot thicker. So what you see here is, as you had said, Brejesh, is Kamala Harris came in late. The media carried her on their shoulders. She had been seen as someone who was unpopular as a vice president, and suddenly she was bringing joy and magic and optimism. And then they put her in front of a camera, and they realize she really doesn't know very much about anything. And so never before in my lifetime have we had 2 candidates who were so disliked and so disparate. Kamala Harris, in the eyes of many Americans, is intellectually unsuited to be president. Donald Trump, in the eyes of many Americans, is emotionally and psychologically unsuited to be president. And that is the choice that we have. And at the moment, as you say, Donald Trump is picking up momentum. Most of the folks on this call are in the investment community. All you have to do is look at shares of DJT, the Donald Trump Media Group, and see it's virtually tripled recently. And then there are other stocks and that would suggest Donald Trump momentum. So that's what I would share at this outset. Look forward to Tyler's view on this.
Thanks.
Thank you, Todd. There's a lot that I absolutely agree with right there. Yes, while Donald Trump is one of the most disliked people in the history of polling, he's also the most popular he's ever been today. If you think of all the things that have gone on with Donald Trump, between January 6th and the felony convictions and all the other things, he is now more popular today than he has ever was in 2016, ever was at any time during his presidency. So
and this is not because of the failed assassination or something, Tyler.
No, I don't think so. I think this is part of what Todd mentioned earlier. There's this nostalgia for the Trump economy that's out there in polling. If you look, that people remember back to the Trump economy, rightly or wrongly. Remember, voters don't vote on spreadsheets and charts. They vote on how they feel and who they feel is going to be good for them. And Todd mentioned, GDP at 3.4% and inflation coming down, but voters don't live in the macro economy like investors live in the macro economy every day. That's not where voters live. Voters live at the grocery store, at the gas station, dropping their kids off at the bus stop, and those sorts of things. And so Todd's absolutely right. When you have food prices that are up 25% than where they were 4 years ago, that is a powerful political thing that it's hard for Kamala Harris to combat. And when she's asked the question, every time she's asked the question, how would you be different than Biden? She doesn't have an answer for that. And as someone who's been in politics for a long time, not having an answer to a question you absolutely know you're going to get, in my opinion, is political malpractice. So yes, $1 billion, all the vibes coming in strong, but there are the basics of politics that in my opinion, Harris isn't doing, and it's hurting her right now. And Trump is seizing on it and peaking, in my opinion, at the right time. And we can talk about it more during when we look at the various swing states. But I think that's an interesting thing. And the other thing I'll say is, well, she did a CNN town hall last night. And again, Todd's exactly right. She can't answer a question. And it was evident again last night for 2 hours on CNN. So it is.
She keeps deflecting, and she doesn't seem to come across as like she has a concrete plan, and pretty, and that's quite sad because I would have thought after replacing Biden with someone else, I really thought she'd be able to kind of pull her weight through.
Yeah, it's like they weren't ready for this scenario. Everyone has kind of been talking about that this scenario very much is a possibility that Biden might have to get out at the last minute or something, and we've been talking about that we all thought it was more of a remote possibility, not an act. I think everyone was still a little, but not after the debate. I don't think people were caught by surprise, but they were. Seemed flat-footed, and they were ready for the vibes, but they weren't ready for the policy.
Well, and when you look at her resume, it is sterling. It is stunning. A prosecutor, an attorney general, a senator, a vice president, and I don't know what she's been doing all those years, because one thing she hasn't been doing is learning policy and learning how to communicate about policy. And you can see how desperate or concerned the campaign is, because remember, when she started this campaign as the presidential candidate, she was shy about doing media because she was hoping, and her people were hoping, they wouldn't have to put her in front of the camera so often. But now she's in front of that camera quite often, as Tyler just said, on CNN last night, on Fox News a couple of days ago. The only reason they're doing that and risking her exposure is they know they are behind and falling behind, I think, every day.
So both of you,
I would agree.
So both of you feel that that the current polls, which seem to indicate, is it a 61% a Trump lead? Is that real?
It's not 60. I think I think you're talking about probability, and you're looking at the betting markets. Maybe a little bit. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
I'm always a little bit skeptical of the betting markets. I just don't. I don't think they're a good forecast of things. I definitely think it. I definitely think it might very well could be a 60-40 though scenario where Trump is Trump has the momentum.
Right.
It's clear that on October 7th, the average of polling showed Harris at 2.1% nationally. I believe now she is down to zero. I have it pulled up. She's down to 0.2% in the average of polling.
Wow.
She's trending in the wrong direction. And if you look at all seven swing states, according to the average of polling, have trended towards Trump and are better for Trump today than they were on October 7th when you compare the two dates. And her margin also nationally is not where it needs to be for her to outperform the electoral college bias that's built in. So it's still tight. It's still close. The election probably comes down to maybe less than 100,000 voters in 3 states. But it is going to be, it is definitely, in my opinion, Donald Trump's to lose at this moment.
Got it.
And one thing to point out, and Tyler can expound on this, Donald Trump's the polling tends to undercount Trump voters because there is a stigma, especially in affluent communities, announcing or admitting your support for Trump. I live in a community where anyone who would put a Trump sign on their lawn would find themselves shamed and banned from the tennis club or the pickleball club. And so generally, Democrat, in this case, Kamala Harris, has to be ahead of Trump by several percentage points in the polls just to make it 50-50. So the fact that it is 50-50 probably means that Trump is several points ahead in the poll. Now, your listeners and viewers today no doubt understand there's a difference between the national popularity count, the vote count, and the electoral count, and the swing state system or situation that we have. And obviously, Tyler can discuss that if you feel that your listeners need a little bit of a primer in that.
That's actually very relevant, and I think you're right. I mean, there's always been, there would be that set of closet lovers for Trump, and it'll take a while before they can openly suggest. So I think it's a very pertinent point you made, Todd. And Tyler, you did mention swing states. So jumping right into the first, so to speak, question, and Todd, picking up on what you said, yes, it's not a popularity contest in that sense. It's about 538 electoral votes split across the various states. And yes, America does vote very clearly blue and red, and it's your 7 states, correct me if I've got them wrong, right? Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, right? But Tyler, I also noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, that both of them, whether it was Nevada and North Carolina, hadn't swung so much recently. It was the remaining 5 states that I thought was swinging a lot more. But the point I was trying to kind of elicit out of you, Tyler, is that everyone's watching the swing states. And as Todd and you alluded that today, what is hurting the average American is that, his purse is feeling lighter and inflation has really hurt him hard. And he wants to go back to the Trump years or glory years. And I think, to be fair to both the candidates, they have put on fairly strong economic policies, whether it's right or wrong, taxes, tariffs, but that's the plank on which they seem to be moving. However, we've seen, Trump try to wing in immigration, and I'm not saying they're softer issues, but immigration and the rise in crime, and with what he did in Ohio, and he raised the whole, what was it, the cat song that got so famous. So I'm just saying that he's bringing in some other issues on the table, and then you have with Kamala Harris coming in, she's kind of connected with the women voters, and the access to abortion now is such a sensitive topic, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, while we do have issues like tariffs and inflation and climate change, but the other issues which I just mentioned, would they effectively swing the swing votes? And in some sense, then you realize it is 2 topics amongst 5 or 6 swing states that's actually changing the way the U.S. elections are moving.
Great question. Let me answer it in a few different ways. Let me first talk about the swing states, and you mentioned it earlier. But the U.S. does not have a national election. We do not. We have 50 separate elections that happen all at the same time, and that's how we elect our presidents, is state by state. So every state is done a little bit differently. So I think that's important. And Todd mentioned this in some of his earlier remarks, that the polling, the under polling of Trump in 2020, it was about 3.9% of polls that they undercounted Trump. Even if that's been fixed and they're accurate now, in my opinion, Trump, if you look at the data, Trump is still ahead. So let's just take Pennsylvania, which I think is the most important swing state. Whoever wins Pennsylvania probably has about a 90% probability of becoming the next president. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, he only needs to win 2 more states. If Harris wins Pennsylvania, she only needs to win 2 more states. If either of them lose Pennsylvania, they need to win 5 of the other 6 swing states. Pennsylvania, those 19 electoral votes are the most important, in my opinion. Pennsylvania, now the average of polling has Trump at 0.5%. On October 24th of 2020, the average of polling had Biden at 5.3%. And on October 24th, 2016, the average of polling in Pennsylvania was 5.6%. Biden ended up winning by 1.2, and Trump ended up winning by 1.2. So what I'm trying to show you, and this is in every, if you look at the data in every swing state, it's like this right now. Trump closes in the last few weeks of the campaign. He is a closer. There's data to prove to that this is a trend, and I don't see any reason right now why that isn't happening here. You did mention abortion. I do think abortion is important. I think abortion is something that could, if there is a chance for Harris, it's people coming and voting on abortion, like we saw in 2022. I think abortion is a bigger issue, though, for the Senate and for maybe Democrats not losing the Senate in Ohio, or maybe picking off and beating Rick Scott in Florida. So I think it's more important issue for the Senate than it is maybe for the presidency. It just doesn't feel to me that it's been the topic that everyone is talking about in Pennsylvania, which is, again, what I think is the most important swing state.
Got it. Todd, would you like to come in?
Well, I would only say that the abortion issue, which, as you say, is very sensitive, and number one on the list of a large percentage, not a majority, but a large percentage of women, is especially strong in states that are already blue. In New York, in California, Donald Trump is not going to win California. The media is located, the major, in those states. And so there is an amplification of the issues that are most important to people in Midtown Manhattan and in downtown Los Angeles. That's not necessarily as strong. Those issues are not necessarily as strong when you go to the swing states in the center of the country.
Yeah. No, I get it. But what about crime? I think immigration and crime, Trump's made so much noise about it. Is that resonating somewhere, with the West and the East Coast, or is that?
I think immigration for sure is the second most important issue of this campaign. The economy is number one, immigration's number two. And I would put immigration, Trump has tried to link those two together, immigration and crime. I think he's actually done a fairly good job of that. So I think immigration absolutely is a major issue. You even have polling from about a month ago. I haven't seen recent polling on it, of Trump's deportation policy. Like, he wants a mass deportation policy. More than 50% of Americans agree with him on mass deportations. So according to a CBS News poll from late September. So it's an interesting issue. It definitely is an issue that favors Trump, in my opinion. It's an issue that Harris has evolved on from where she was in 2019 to where she is today. And I think that also goes back to a lot of voters don't know who she is. Trump may be, as Todd mentioned, emotionally disqualified from being president. But he's very authentic to people. Like they feel like they know him. I think that's one of Harris's problems on issues like immigration, where she's done a complete 180 since the time that she ran. People view that as inauthentic. And then when she's asked by the media about it and maybe why you've changed, and she can't answer that question, it's very inauthentic. Being for the border wall now, when you called it, Donald Trump's vanity project, and that it was a human rights violation essentially to build the border wall, and that was your position 4 years ago, and now you support it. Voters kind of see through that.
And it's even worse than that, because for about 3 years, the Biden-Harris administration refused to admit there was an immigration migrant border problem. They claimed that it was basically just conservative right-wing Fox News Trump conspiracy theorists, and didn't admit how many people were coming over the border. And let me put this in perspective. You think about major countries on the world stage like Sweden, Norway, Hungary. They have approximately 10 million citizens. Now, of course, that's dwarfed by countries like India and the U.S., but 10 million. The U.S., virtually watched as an entire country, 10 million people cross the border, and the administration denied that it was happening. And Kamala Harris, at various points, was called the border czar. And now the administration says, oh, no, she was never the border czar. Well, what was she in control of? What responsibility has she had? So it's a combination of the immigration combined with the absolute denial that there's been a problem. Now, Tyler points to the authenticity, and I think that really comes out in Donald Trump. And again, many of his statements, many of his actions are indefensible if you're talking to your children and how you want adults to behave in a room. However, the authenticity is so real. A few days ago, I'm sure many of your viewers watched clips of his working at McDonald's. And it was a remarkable performance, because you could see he actually was focused on the French fries and focused on and handing out and engaging with the drive-through folks who were there. It wasn't a typical politician comes in, shakes a hand, watches, observes, and nods and congratulates them on the fight. No, he actually was acting as if he was working there, being Donald Trump. And I think the American people are wondering, if Kamala Harris was working at that McDonald's, would she even get right whether the order was French fries or McNuggets or fish? I think they'd assume that she'd get the order mixed up and give them or engage in a conversation instead of actually delivering the burgers. Donald Trump did it and demonstrated his authenticity, which offsets to a large extent, in the eyes of many Americans, the emotional or personality disorders, if you will. He gets the job done, and there's not a moment in the day where he is not Donald Trump. You just don't get that from Kamala Harris.
No, never a dull moment around with him. But I think, like you said, he seems to be able to get the job done. And I think this authenticity point is very valid. People know what they're getting into, and he seems real in that sense. Great. Todd, I'm going to come at you with the next one. This is right now straight into the thick of what the plans from both parties are. And Tyler, feel free to weigh in. But we've seen. I mean, I've read the Democrats' plan, and it's true to a typical Democrat plan where it's taxing the higher income class, I believe there's a big tax swap coming for first-time home buyers. I think there's a tax amnesty for people with having younger children. And I believe there's also a proposed tax for even unencumbered gains that you have. I don't know how they're going to kind of settle that. But it's true Democrat, true socialist, and probably going to cost the fiscal deficit an additional $3 to $4 trillion. And then for the first time, you have a Republican candidate who's actually, in some sense, trying to outspend the Democrat candidate. Having said that, there's also Trump's Make America Great Again campaign, and a proposed reduction in corporate tax from 21 to 15 for Make in America products. And, a 10%, and all of this is going to get funded by a 10% tariff, I believe, on goods getting imported into the country, and maybe 60% for Chinese goods, right? And it's probably going to cost an additional $2-3 trillion as compared to the Democrat plan. So the point I have, or the question I have for you, Todd, is how do you see? I mean, it's great to say let's make America great again, and we will not import from outside, but I don't know whether America has that level of a trained employees who can kind of add value to that. And if that happens, all of this is highly inflationary, right? So what's that going to do with interest rates? So happy to hear your thoughts around this, Todd.
Well, there are a whole lot of topics there, and several bidding wars that are going on, and a bidding war to see who might seem to be least responsible of all on fiscal policy. So Kamala Harris says she wants to exempt tips from income tax. Donald Trump replies by saying, wait, you stole my idea. I already proposed exempting tips. So I'm going to add something new. I'm going to exempt overtime pay from the income tax. So if this actually were to take place, virtually every American would figure out how to categorize every dollar they make as either a tip or overtime pay. In the first Trump administration, Republicans and the White House successfully limited the deduction for state taxes from your federal income taxes, a deduction for state taxes, a deduction for interest payments on mortgage, and so on. This is known in the media and in Washington as as SALT, S-A-L-T. But now Donald Trump is saying he wants to reverse the Republican policy that was put into place. So we've got all sorts of things. Kamala Harris's idea of taxing unrealized gains is entirely unworkable. We wouldn't have enough IRS agents. We'd have to, recruit the CIA and the FBI in order to monitor such things. So basically, my point is on tax policy, you've got a bidding war that is not realistic in terms of what can actually get through Congress. Now, when I'm done speaking, I think it would be really helpful for Tyler, if you will, to discuss the House and the Senate, because Donald Trump or Kamala Harris may win the White House. The question is, can they get tax policy in particular, through the Congress? And even within the Republican Party, there are divisions. If Donald Trump has a sweep of the election, that doesn't necessarily mean Republicans are going to go along with $7 trillion of spending and tax cuts. On the tariff side, if you recall, when Donald Trump came into office, everyone thought the first countries he would target would be China and Mexico. But instead, his first tariffs went against our mortal enemy to the north, Canada. Yeah. Then Joe Biden came into office, and everyone thought, well, Joe Biden is in the White House to undo everything Donald Trump did. But Joe Biden kept nearly everything in place, and that it added some of his own. So on the tariff front, we need to separate Donald Trump's proposals from his bargaining position, because Donald Trump, he's personally not a gambler. He doesn't gamble, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke marijuana, but he does gamble at the negotiating table. And so there's a lot of negotiating or posing and poising that's going on at the moment. The fact is, if we were to impose a 10% tariff across the board, as you say, that would be a strain on production. That would make it more difficult in the fight against inflation. It also, obviously, the U.S. Has tariff disputes with India, for instance, over steel and aluminum and other products. When we, the U.S., raise tariffs on steel, it hurts companies that make things in the U.S. from steel and aluminum. So soda companies that have to use cans, car companies that use steel, and so on. So there are victims in the U.S. in the manufacturing sector of higher tariffs. I don't think we will have a 10% across the board tariff in a Trump administration, but I think we're going to have some really sharp negotiating sessions. And one thing that has changed in the last 8 years, when Donald Trump came into office and started talking about tariffs on China and a hard-nosed approach on China, most of the Democratic Party and a good part of the Republican Party thought that was somewhat extremist, that China wasn't really an economic enemy. And now, over the course of the last 8 years, it's become apparent to politicians of all parties in the U.S. that China is determined to have hegemony in geopolitics in Asia and hegemony in the world economy. So there is a greater belief that Trump may have been right, in fact, in all of his anti-China rhetoric when he took office in 2017.
And I'll add a couple of things as well to what Todd said. I'll start on the China point. China is also an 80% issue in the United States. 80% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China. And why that's important is it means with regards to China and tariffs and other things, the economic arguments of why you shouldn't do things are very much trumped, sorry for the pun, trumped by political arguments. The political argument is going to win out. Economic arguments are not the arguments that are winning the day necessarily in Washington, especially on China and on trade these days. And so I think that also is going to bolster Trump's what he plans to do. Right. I agree with Todd that the 10% across the board tariffs is something that's not going to happen. What Trump's trying to do is create leverage to negotiate. Former Trump White House Chief of Staff is a friend of mine, and he told it to me this way. You got to realize that Trump does not play chess, but he is the world's best checkers player. And that's kind of what he's wanting to do is he wants to set up a framework where he can go out and negotiate bilateral trade deals all across the globe. He doesn't want to do big multilateral trade deals, but he wants to finish the US-UK trade deal that was about 2/3 of the way done. He probably, he and Modi started talking in India about if they can get a trade deal. He wants to start doing more of those bilateral deals where he's going to want to push for reciprocal trade. He is going to want to push for lower tariffs and market access for U.S. companies coming into places as well. So those are going to be some of the things that he's going to want to do, and he's going to want to use threats to create leverage. China's different. I think he's going to act early on China, but the rest of the world, I think, is that way.
Oh no, that's pretty insightful, and I was just actually shocked. For each of the rounds that we had, I've got a red column and a blue column. Sorry.
Can I mention one more thing real quick, because I think it's important, especially on the tax debate. Watch even if Republicans sweep, watch what the margin is in the Senate. If it's a 51 seat majority for Republicans in the Senate, policy is going to look much different than if it's a 53 or 54 seat majority. For example, Trump says he wants to lower the corporate tax rate from 21 down to 15. I'm skeptical at a 51 seat majority in the Senate that that's going to be possible. there's enough populist senators who are skeptical of big business, think Rand Paul, think Josh Hawley, that would maybe stand up and say, no, we don't want to do that. But at 53 or 54 seats, those senators are marginalized in that realm. It's the same exact reason why Joe Manchin was so powerful the last 2 years of the Biden administration. It's because it's a closely divided Senate. So watch the margin in the Senate.
That's a good insight. No, I was just kind of weighing the points as well to see, and I think as of now, from the 2 rounds that we've had, clearly it looks like there is a Trump plan, even in something that seems as mad as a 10% tariff on everything is probably is a negotiating tool more than anything. Tyler, we were chatting earlier, and you mentioned that you recently traveled to China, and so my next question is actually around geopolitics and the impact of the U.S. elections on foreign policy. And I know we've kind of started the conversation a bit, but it'd be lovely to get into the thick of it and to hear how we already have a Democrat policy going on. So what happens in a way if we do bring Trump back, and how is that going to change the policy? And we also have 2 wars going on, and I think at least both of them don't seem to end, and the Middle East one is only spreading. Although I do believe that the Democrats and the Republicans, both of them are kind of pro-Israel at the minute, and both of them, assert their right and their claim for independence and to defend themselves. There's a tragedy, and there's a calamity, human calamity going on as well in Gaza. But for at least I don't see from a political view both of these candidates bickering on that. However, it's very different when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war. I mean, I picked up some comments where Trump was saying that given a chance, he'd shut down the war in 24 hours. I mean, I don't know how real that is, but what's going to happen if Trump comes to power on American policy and these wars?
It's a great question. Let me start with Ukraine, and I'll move to the Middle East. And I think we also need to talk about the Indo Pacific, because India is going to be a huge piece of an Indo Pacific strategy as well. And I also do think Indo Pacific is the number one geopolitical issue for the U.S. China is the number one, whether it's Harris or Trump. I do think that, and I think everything else going on in the world are kind of distractions to that number one priority. But with regards to Ukraine, Trump is no fan of this war. We all know that. And I think what Trump will do is he will, again, use what he does to create leverage to create a negotiating table. He is going to tell Putin, if you don't agree to come to a negotiating table under my terms, I'm going to take the restrictions off the U.S. weapons that the U.S. has given to Zelensky, allow him to reach into Russia. I'm going to give Zelensky more and make it much harder for you. We are going to ratchet up sanctions enforcement to target your fossil fuel industry a little bit more. I think there's things where he's going to make it clear that he will turn the screws to get Putin to agree to come to a negotiating table. And I think he does the same thing. At the same time, he does the same thing to Zelensky. If Zelensky doesn't agree to come to a negotiating table, he will say, well, when this round of funding is over, then you're going to be cut off, and that is very hard for Zelensky. So I think that is what he does, and I think I don't think you can do this on day one, like he says, but I think what he's signaling is it's a first 100 days agenda item that he wants to try to tackle. With regards to the Middle East, I think Israel is going to do what Israel is going to do, regardless of if it's Trump or Harris. Israel is in this to finish the fight. They are obviously have a mentality that Iran's behavior via their proxies and others towards Israel is done, and that Israel's not going to stand for it anymore. And I think that continues, again, whether it's Trump or Harris. What's different is U.S. Iranian policy will be different under a Trump than under a Harris. U.S. Saudi policy will be different under Trump than under Harris. I think those are kind of the two big things. U.S. Saudi relations probably improve dramatically overnight when Trump if Trump is to win. He's got a great relationship with MBS. I think that the strained relationship that Biden has with MBS would likely continue under Harris. And so I do think that matters when you're looking at the maximum pressure campaign that Trump has signaled he's going to bring back in on Iran, tightening up sanctions enforcement, really targeting Iran's oil industry. But at the same time you're doing that, if you can convince Saudi to increase production to kind of make sure you have an equilibrium with a balance exactly on with oil markets as you're upping pressure on Iran, I think that's something that Trump is going to try to do. On China, Trump's going to try to manage the relationship himself, where Biden has mostly managed the relationship with senior level aides, Blinken and Yellen and Jake Sullivan. I think Trump's going to try to manage it at the quote unquote CEO to CEO level, if you will, or Trump to Xi. But that's not to say there's not going to be others that are important. And look at who Trump appoints to these positions. Tom Cotton, possibly at Secretary of Defense, Marco Rubio, maybe at CIA or State, and very likely that Pompeo could come back, or Robert O'Brien as well, to State. Those gentlemen all have one thing in common. They're currently under sanction by Beijing. So there's very much the possibility that top level senior aide, cabinet level people that would be also charged with managing parts of the China relationship are walking in currently being under sanction by Beijing. It's going to be a contentious relationship, and I think people should expect that. But the relationship, as you mentioned, changed with Trump the first time. And I equated to Trump kind of putting a vehicle on the road and started driving it down the road. Biden got in that vehicle and kept going to the same place. I think when Trump gets in, he's going to get in the vehicle and he's going to put his foot on the gas and go even faster. But it's all headed to the same direction.
Todd, would you like to come in on this?
Yes, I would, on the subject of Ukraine, nod my head in agreement with virtually everything Tyler said. On the Middle East, I would say this. The Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan was disastrous for Middle East policy, not just for Middle East lives. It encouraged the Iranians. It encouraged Hamas and Hezbollah, and it has been an awful thing. And where I would disagree with Tyler about it doesn't. If he was suggesting it doesn't matter too much which of the parties win. If Kamala Harris wins and the Democratic Party does well, that is a signal to the Democratic Party that they are in a new era where they can win national elections without substantial Jewish support. The Biden administration has been very ambivalent. If you listen and watch closely on Middle East policy, yes, they'll say positive things about Israeli self-control and self-determination and defense, but at the same time, they in public warn we will not send these weapons or these weapons. They go to Michigan and campaign and try to encourage votes in the Islamic community. So certainly within the state of Israel, and in the case of many Jewish communities in the U.S., there's a very strong feeling that the Democratic Party is in the process of abandoning them. And if Harris wins, that car will continue to drive in that direction away from Israel. I would say on the Donald Trump side, one of his proudest accomplishments was the Abraham Accords. The idea that you were able to get Saudi Arabia and Benjamin Netanyahu and Bahrain and the UAE to talk fondly of one another to talk about opening embassies and so on. The fact that Saudi Arabia has more or less stayed on the sidelines of this war between Israel and the Palestinians is actually a tribute to the Abraham Accords and their expectation that Donald Trump may come back in and they can bring things together again. When the Biden administration came into office, one of the first things they did was to side, well, not exactly with the Houthis against Saudi Arabia, but basically make it very clear they were not necessarily on the Saudi side. So I do think it is a radical, if I will, change back in policy if Trump were to come in from the point of view of the Saudis and the UAE and the Israelis. I think and I'm sure we're going to get to the subject of India as well. Obviously, Donald Trump has this sort of bromance with Prime Minister Modi, which will continue if Trump comes into office. There is some legitimate concern that perhaps Harris and Walz may be a little bit more sympathetic to China. We know that vice presidential nominee Walz has spent a lot of time in China. There are obviously great tensions on the line of actual control in the Himalayas. And I think it's the question in India's mind will be if Kamala Harris and Walz come into power, will they be as reliable friends, or will the administration start looking at India and Hindu nationalism the way that they look at nationalism in other countries? And so I think there's a real question over U.S.-India relations. Not that I don't believe it becomes endangered. I don't believe that there'll be great tension, but on the margins, I think there could be a move that could make some headlines.
No, I think you're right. I mean, we've seen on that topic of India and US, we've definitely seen a fairly healthy equation between Modi and Donald Trump. And I think Tyler's point that, Indo Pacific is going to be important, whether it is kind of the reemergence of dependency on Japan, again, by the US, simply because, if there's going to be any action in the next decade or so, and kind of a third front of the war coming up, it could be on this side. And, the US would want as many allies. So whether it's Japan or even India for that matter, right? So Quad and all of these things are just, I think, different ways to say the same. So great. Well, I'll quickly, Todd, while I have you on this one, I'd just like to hear your views, Todd, on markets. Because finally, like you said, most of the audience on this side is all on the financial treasury side or on banks or corporates. Usually, we two parts to this question. One is there's obviously a central bank that loves their independence, but we've heard many times from Trump that he'd like to have some kind of presidential oversight of the Fed, and I don't think there's too much love lost between him and Powell as well. So what's likely to happen out there? And the second is around U.S. interest rates and inflation, because today you have a Republican candidate again whose policies seem fairly inflationary, and yet at the same time he's pretty vocal about having a weak dollar. And when you announce 60% potential tariffs on China, negotiation or not, it's going to, the Chinese are going to react by devaluing the yen, and then, how do you have a weak dollar? So what's your view on interest rates, currencies, and, the Fed in light of the election, Todd? Tyler, you can come in after as well.
Yes. Well, the first thing I would say is we've got to think about Donald Trump properly and where his grounding is. I have to tell you, my family life, my grandfather was a colleague and sometimes partner of Donald Trump's father. After World War II, they built homes together in the Carolinas and in Virginia. And my grandfather would tell me that every night they would have dinner together, and then my grandfather and a man named Bill Levitt, who was famous in American real estate, would play cards. But Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, refused to stay at the table to gamble. But my point here is Donald Trump is a real estate developer. His father was it. And what do developers want most of all, besides tenants and buyers? Low interest rates. Donald Trump believes that low interest rates are always a good thing, and that banks are all and markets are always setting interest rates higher than they should be. Well, that's his mindset as a landlord and as a developer. As a president, we know he's got some responsibility for inflation. Now, your viewers may already know that the president has authority to choose governors of the Federal Reserve Board and choose the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. So there is influence there. But he does not like Jay Powell because he felt Jay Powell kept interest rates too high. The problem is if Donald Trump succeeds in generating a strong economy or maintaining the 3% growth that we have in this fourth quarter of 2024, it's going to be very difficult for any Federal Reserve governor to cut interest rates significantly. One thing that you've seen in the last month is interest rates. The Fed cut Fed funds rate by 50 basis points, and yet the 10-year note has been climbing. Why has the 10-year note been climbing? Now, some people say, well, it's a sign of Donald Trump. It's a worry about. No, the 10-year note has been climbing because U.S. GDP forecasts have been upgraded by about 50% in the last month. If you look at the Atlanta GDP now forecast, a month ago it was about 2.5%. Now it's about 3.5%. So interest rates are actually trickling upwards. And Donald Trump can, of course, complain that it's the Federal Reserve Board's fault, but in a sense, it's also a fault of the fact that the economy is actually running quite hot. In terms of the dollar, if Donald Trump gets a strong economy, if we have loose fiscal policy, it's very difficult to have a depreciating dollar unless something negative happens. So I think he may learn to like a stronger dollar. Some of his advisors historically have. In the first Trump administration, my old friend Larry Kudlow used to talk about, quote, king dollar. Larry Kudlow was Trump's chief economic advisor. Now Scott Bessent, who worked for the Soros Fund and is a possible Treasury secretary, believes in a firm dollar. So, look, this is very complicated. I want to make sure I save a little time for Tyler to add to it. But Donald Trump wants a stronger economy overall. And if that means he has to live with the dollar being firm, I think he'll accept a strong dollar if it's a result of getting the economic policies that he wants and generating strong growth.
Very well put. Very well put.
I will add just a couple of things on the Jay Powell note. My view is that Trump is not going to fire Jay Powell, but he will obviously not reappoint him as for another term. He may say he's firing, and in Trump's mind, that means I'm not going to nominate him again. There may be some things where they do maybe try to get the new whoever his replacement is going to be confirmed early. So there may be some games that he tries to play, but I don't think we're going to have this big battle over the independence of the Fed and if the president can fire the Fed chair. I think a large part of that is as Todd mentioned, the Fed's entering into a rate cutting cycle, and that matters. On rates as well, though, I think one thing that everyone needs to pay attention to and have the back of their minds. The U.S. government spends somewhere between $7 and $7.5 trillion a year right now.
Right.
A little over $1 trillion a year is in debt service, and that is right now. If you look at projections, has a hockey stick curve the wrong way. And so I'm not a Fed analyst. I don't. That's another person in our firm. But I will say for policymakers on Capitol Hill, they are very concerned about debt service crowding out the ability to do other things that the U.S. government needs to do. And so it's going to be an interesting, maybe you have pressure coming more from Capitol Hill and Trump together on lowering interest rates to kind of lower the impact on the debt service that the U.S. has to pay.
Great. Great. I think what we'll do is we'll, pull in Tanay and we'll have a few questions from customers, but I just wanted to say, thanks. And I was just making a few notes to summarize kind of what we spoke. And it's one, obviously the first thing is seemingly very clear that a 50-50 is not necessarily a 50-50 given the Trump, not everyone wants to kind of openly allude to being a Trump lover. So, and today Trump seems to be leading. So that's point number one. The second is the point you made about Pennsylvania being such an important state, noted on that. And then the economy and immigration being the two kind of core issues. I think it's important for all of us to note from a geopolitical relation that yes, Indo Pacific is going to be important in the future. But Todd, your point on how important Saudi relations are and what Trump brings in there is something that we had forgotten. So thanks for highlighting that. I think we'll also some of the other takeaways was about the stronger dollar, and while it might not be something that Trump's been calling out for, the fact that if he gets a lot of what he's been asking for, he would probably be happy to live with a stronger dollar. So a lot of good tidbits that have come out and highlights for us. Tanay, if you're listening, do we have any customer questions that have come in the internet?
We have enough and more customer questions. I'll try and limit them in the interest of time. The first one's from Abhishek Chandak of Infosys. He asks, we're going to have high US debt and quickly rising US debt. Comments on the US dollar from Trump and maybe Fed Chair Powell. Potential use of the dollar as a weapon by the US Treasury, perhaps in trade and other negotiations. How far are we from the USD being challenged geopolitically? You're already seeing some people using other currencies to price commodities. So is it a real risk coming in?
Any one of you?
Donald Trump at various points has more or less threatened countries that, in his mind, were thinking about abandoning the U.S. dollar. The fact is, the currency is a zero-sum game. It's a zero-sum world. So if you don't like the U.S. dollar, what currency do you like? You like the Chinese yuan? Really? If there were a free flow of yuan in and out of China, the yuan would plummet. If middle class Chinese were permitted to take their money out, you like the Japanese yen. The population is shrinking. You like the euro at a time when the great manufacturing might of the German economy is sputtering. So it's very hard to see which countries look attractive in terms of their currency to replace the U.S. dollar. Now, of course, I'm sure there's some crypto fans here, and Donald Trump does have a sympathetic view of crypto, and is attracted. That helps in social media because the crypto folks really like to participate in social media. And you know this because Kamala Harris is now making overtures to the crypto community to countermand the Democratic regulators and senators who are more suspicious of crypto. So essentially, I'm not concerned. I don't think Donald Trump is particularly concerned that people will be abandoning the U.S. dollar. Now, does that mean that the U.S. fiscal situation is good? No, it's terrible. Another way to put what Tyler was saying, the burden of the debt, the U.S. now interest on the debt, the mere interest on the debt is greater than what we spend on the defense budget. And this has been, in my mind, not just malpractice, but almost a criminal act by Treasury departments. Starting about 11 years ago, I was writing pieces in the Wall Street Journal urging the U.S. to issue 50 or 100-year bonds to lock in the unbelievably historically low interest rates of the past decade that existed until about 2 years ago. and Treasury secretaries did not do that. Donald Trump entertained that idea. I know that from friends in the Oval Office, but there was not enough of an effort. So instead, the U.S. is now borrowing at 4% instead of borrowing at 2%, and it is going to be punishing for future generations. However, as I said, there's a bit of a zero-sum game here. So if you don't like the U.S., you tell me which major currency is represented by a country with strong GDP growth, with the possibility of a balanced budget, the possibility of paying pensioners in their retirement, and then we can have a conversation about which currencies might attract away from the U.S. dollar during the Trump years or the Kamala Harris years.
Thanks, Todd. Our next questions are from Sneha of Vedanta. She asks, what about a contested US election? There was talk about this earlier with talk back to the Al Gore and Bush days, and maybe even further back. What would that look like politically, geopolitically, economically, rates and the dollar?
I do think the possibility of a quote-unquote contested election is out there, but I think the biggest possibility around a contested election is a recount, specifically a recount in Pennsylvania. If Pennsylvania is so close that there is a recount, then I think that, and there was a recount in Pennsylvania in 2016. It just didn't matter that there was a recount because Trump actually didn't need to win Pennsylvania to win the presidency. So I do think it matters, and timing matters. If there is a contested election, it has to be over that contested election. I believe it's December 7th is when constitutionally the Electoral College has some deadlines. So it could last up for a while. There are some scenarios as well out there. Congress has to certify the election on January 6th. The Congress is sworn in on January 3rd. If we have another, for some reason, contentious speaker vote, and we don't know who a speaker is for 3 or 4 days, I think this is a very remote scenario. We may miss that January 6th deadline because there's no Congress to certify the election at that moment. Right. So there are some things out there. They're in my view, they're a little more remote. I do think whoever wins, especially if Trump wins, I think it's going to be by a bigger margin than people think, maybe outside the margin of what a contested election would look like. And I think if Harris wins, Trump is going to try to contest, but I think it's going to be very difficult for him to contest. Remember, in 2020, when Trump was president, he lost every lawsuit that he filed to try and overturn or contest the 2020 election. The courts were pretty clear and pretty strong on this. And he's going to be even in a weaker position as a non-incumbent if he tries to contest as well. The effects on the dollar, though, I'll leave that on Todd to answer.
Well, I mean, it's unlikely it would be a good thing for the U.S. dollar to have such chaos. But I think, as Tyler said, the polls are not really looking as if it's going to be that kind of standoff. Although I would point out, and again, I defer to Tyler on this, it is almost impossible for Pennsylvania to report its numbers on the evening of the election. So if it comes down to Pennsylvania, it is almost certain, and this is right, I think, Tyler, that we won't have an answer on election day, and we probably won't have an answer the next day either, and maybe for some time to come. So there's almost guaranteed uncertainty starting with election night.
Yeah, if you remember in 2020, it took 4 days for the AP essentially to call the election.
Right.
So we may have a sense, we may think it seems like this is going to be the outcome, but officially knowing the outcome could take a few days. I agree with that.
And by the way, I would point out, if Donald Trump wants to challenge, he'll be hard-pressed to find lauyers because there are too many lawyers who spun through and are still trying to collect on their payments for the contests of 4 years ago.
Great point.
Thanks. Yes. Okay. So there's one from Kannan of Amara Raja. He asks, we've spoken about the differences quite a bit between Harris and Trump. What's the common agenda? How much fiscal is common? How much protectionism is common? How much industrial policy is common between the two?
I do think there's some commonality. I think, and Todd mentioned this earlier, we now have two anti-trade parties in the United States. We have two protectionist parties. So I think there is some commonality on tariffs. I think there's difference on to what scale, but I think overall, yes, there's some commonality. Look at the U.S. Steel, Nippon Steel deal right now. Both Trump and Harris Biden are opposing the deal. And again, not because of, in my view, not because of economics, because of politics. So there are some protectionist feelings from both of them that I think went out. On the taxes, I do think there's some commonality on taxes as well. The taxes that expire the end of 2025 are mostly geared towards the middle class. And so I do think there's commonality on those taxes, those middle class taxes getting extended. There's commonality on an increased child tax credit. There's commonality on those. There's probably commonality of about $3.5 to $4 trillion of tax extenders between the two as well. And so that's my view maybe on some of the commonality, and leave it to Todd as well.
I would also point out that both of them have small business tax agendas. Kamala Harris has proposed a sort of $50,000 write-off for small businesses. Donald Trump, in the earlier tax cuts, and again, is talking about lower taxes for small businesses. So that's in common. Just as Tyler had pointed out, we have two parties that are anti-trade. It's quite interesting. We now have two parties that are more suspicious of business combinations, more aggressive in antitrust policy. It had been that Republicans were quite laissez-faire about antitrust, but Donald Trump is a little bit more suspicious, especially when it comes to media and tech companies. His administration tried to block AT&T from merging with Time Warner and so on. On non-tech, non-media, the Trump administration is a little bit more lenient. The Kamala Harris-Biden administration is very aggressive on antitrust. Everything, and even including ladies' handbags. They're currently trying to block the maker of Coach handbags from merging with the maker of Michael Kors handbags, and have claimed there's some new category called affordable luxury, and that if these companies got together, they could corner the affordable luxury market. That sort of thing the Trump administration is not quite interested in. But there is this question over business combinations and how big businesses can get before the Justice Department of either party becomes involved.
Very, very good. Tanay, I think, in lieu of the time, let's just have one last question and then let's call it a wrap, please.
All right. So there's one from Snehal of Blackstone. Over the past few years, we've seen the investment climate not do very well, especially with the PE industry. What could be done either by Harris or by Trump to bring things back?
So, Tanay, I'm sorry, I missed part of that question. Which industry are we talking about?
Sorry, the private equity industry.
Oh, the private equity industry. Well, look, I do think that the scrutiny over business combinations has had a chilling effect. I do think that in the Biden-Harris administration, there has been a negative view of private equity in the sense that, and you know this because whenever a Republican runs for office, going back to Mitt Romney running for president, and there was any discussion of private equity, it always came down to condemning. Well, what do private equity people do? They buy companies, they fire folks, and then they try to flip it. So that sort of, political attitude has had a chilling effect. I think, between the two candidates, there are industries that some favor and some don't. Energy, it's very clear. Donald Trump is about drilling. He's about natural gas. He's about oil. He's also about nuclear. The Kamala Harris administration is about the sun shining and the wind blowing. And companies like Exxon and smaller companies in the energy field that private equity may be interested in would do much better in a Trump administration, unless it's so-called green energy, in which case they do better with the Harris administration. So there are industries in private equity where you can put together a Trump portfolio and a Harris portfolio. The one example I would give you, look up a company called GEO, G-E-O. What do? They manage migrant detention centers and prisons. That stock has been rallying because it's a Trump stock. So companies, smaller companies that service that industry will prosper more likely under a Trump administration than a Biden administration where they'd be shut down, or a Harris administration. So I think private equity needs to be in the right field depending on who wins the presidency. I might last add, I occasionally comment on this on Twitter. You can find me at EconTodd, and I'm happy to continue this conversation with you and Access clients.
I think both Todd and Tyler, you're going to get enough hits after this on your LinkedIn and on some of your Twitter posts. But thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, audience, for bearing with us. I hope, you could find a lot of these points insightful. We'll collate all of this. It'll be up on the website along with the link to the whole talk. Thank you. And lovely having both of you, and appreciate you being on the call. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Axis Bank, this concludes the discussion. I want to take a moment to convey our gratitude to all our speakers for their time and the benefit of their vast experiences. We look forward to our customers joining us soon for the next edition of Treasury Market Talks. A recording will be available in case you wish to have this passed on to your colleagues. Do connect with your relationship managers for help. Once again, thank you for joining us. You may now log out from the webinar, please. Thank you.